something allowed as acting. For the topic, I would not like to share. This is a very expertise area. I'll leave this to the experts and to all who are here in this debate. I'd like again to express my gratitude to the experts who have accepted this challenge session of the working group on anti-corruption in the framework of the European Movement and National Convention for the EU. As a coordinator of this group, it is the greatest honor for me and pleasure that we speak on one of the most important topics when we speak about public finances, and in particular importance is its importance in the process of EU integration. In the first part, I will not comment much because today's panelists are very much more competent with much higher knowledge and experience, and they can contribute even more to the opening of the current topics and issues that we can deal with in today's session. This panel is opening now, probably with one of the most acquainted experts in the context of Macedonia, but also on the entire Western Balkans, and that is not occasion, because the World Bank is not only a supporter but also a partner and financer of many more important key processes in the countries that are aspiring for membership, in particular the WB countries. I'll not make it long. I'll give now the floor to Mrs. Anja Mađarević-Suster, senior economist for the Western Balkan countries and country economist in the World Bank for North Macedonia. Sanja, I would like to ask you, and additionally on what you say in the first part of today's discussion, we spoke about it is a challenge to link good governance and fiscal rules with concrete reforms. That is not an unknown mechanism for the World Bank. The WB has mechanisms for budget support that are linked with the reforms. But among others, I'd like to ask you how it is challenging now in such a crisis time to implement such mechanisms, in particular knowing that the fiscal room, not only of Macedonia, but all countries of the WB is limited. And on the other hand, we require both growth, but also fiscal consolidation. Please.
First, thank you, Victor. My apology for not being able to. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So I couldn't come today in person. Unfortunately, COVID is still present, and a lot of traveling doesn't help with not being exposed to such viruses. But this is a new normal. Thank you for inviting me to this convention. I think communication among different stakeholders is extremely important, in particular during the pre-accession time, and having more involvement of the civil society and non-governmental institutions in the process of pre-accession, I think helps a lot. It did help to the country I come from, Croatia, because these are small countries, the capacities are limited, and therefore extending the government capacity by relying on non-governmental sector is extremely helpful. Understanding where you want to go during this pre-accession process and also post-accession is extremely important, so that every single sector of the economy can contribute to this goal. So I have prepared a small presentation. I don't know whether I can share the screen. I hope.
Yes, you can.
Okay, thank you very much. And I hope you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So I want to kind of step back why based rules, fiscal policy is important. Where we are today in North Macedonia, post-crisis, we are in a situation of growth, potential growth being lower than in the pre-crisis period, and I'm thinking of multiple sequence crises that we have experienced since 2020. And we also in a situation when inflation remains sticky, something that has also not been seen for a couple of decades. So having a very close coordination of fiscal and monetary policies and proper sequencing is extremely important, so that the both authorities in a way work in sync in order to, on one side, understand where we are in the cycle, help with taming the inflationary expectations, but on the other side also not to kill growth by restrictive, policies. Darko, can you please turn off the mic because I can hear you in parallel. Secondly, the financing costs have surged. Today, North Macedonia is experiencing six-fold higher interest payments on its borrowing from abroad, and this calls, for the reduction of the gross financing needs. Otherwise, the interest payments, which already are rising and taking a high allocation of budgetary resources, will grow even further. Third, Victor mentioned what is important is that while you rebuild this, strengthen the fiscal sustainability and also try to rebuild fiscal buffers for any future shocks, it is important to safeguard those spending that would deliver higher sustainable growth, because this would also then boost revenue base and also help with the consolidation. So it's not either or. It should be a coordinated approach to safeguard those productive elements of the spending that would then lift the revenue base in the future. So what we are suggesting is that the fiscal strategy needs to be designed for both recovery and stabilization. And there are four elements to it. One is that the debt needs to be, so short-term debt needs to be stabilized, and also fiscal buffers need to be rebuilt. North Macedonia is the country which has not really reduced much the deficit since 2020, even compared to the region. Overall, we are in a cycle of the fiscal deficit around 5% on average since 2020. Secondly, the PFM institutions, public finance management institutions, need to be strengthened, including imposing the fiscal rules as well as having independent fiscal oversight. And this is important not only for the country, but also important for ensuring investors, in particular into your Eurobonds, that there is a continuity of the fiscal policy, that it is credible, it will not erode sustainability and the repayment capacity in the future. Third part needs to deal with the revenue mobilization, and in this area, it's not only focus on tax policy adjustments, but also on improving collection and compliance, which is eroded by very high informality. And fourth, focus needs to be also, and not least important, needs to be on addressing spending inefficiencies. We found that with the same allocation of spending, the country can deliver better results in the spending areas. And this is also important so that this additional spending, wasted spending, can be used for supporting the green transition. And now through few charts. One, which I mentioned earlier, is that we haven't seen much of the decline in fiscal deficit since 2020. And this has also led to a very sticky public debt. And you could see that in our latest regular economic report, Most of the countries, even in the region, in the Western Balkan region, have been able to reduce deficits to below 3% last year. And even this year, they will be also around 3%. So this was not the case in North Macedonia. The country is not different in terms of structure so much that would call for larger fiscal deficits to be present, in particular not after the inflation has also boosted revenue collection. So this is important to have in mind, and as a short-term priority, reducing the deficit and reducing the debt would be needed. I'm sorry. Why reducing the debt? If you compare the country with the EU peers, you can still argue that the debt level is moderate compared to the peer countries. However, peer countries like small EU states, in fact, are on the left part of this chart rather than on the right part of the chart. And the red column presents North Macedonia in 2013 and in 2020, and you could see a sharp rise in general government debt, public debt as GDP ratio. So the country clearly now went into the direction of states which had over several years, even some of them even decades, problems with reducing their indebtedness. However, these are also countries that belong to the Eurozone, which North Macedonia is not part of it. So in a way, these countries are protected, safeguarded against the increased financing cost by being a members of Eurozone. This is not the case for North Macedonia. And therefore, we also see a surge in financing costs for the borrowing abroad. Secondly, the country also needs to improve the credit rating. It now belongs to the non-investment credit rating group and hasn't seen any changes over the last couple of years. So improving the credit rating would be also important to reduce sovereign risk premium. This is important not only for refinancing of the government debt, but also for reducing the financing costs for private sector. So to recap, why is fiscal consolidation needed? What we argue should be a short-term priority. One is to put public debt growth on a sustainable path, retaining macro stability. Secondly, as you prepare for the EU accession, you would need to create fiscal space that would be needed to absorb EU funds, but also to contribute to the EU budget. And you may think this is a distant future, but if the aspirations are for accession in 2030, you need to know that in the first few years upon accession, in the, let's say first 3 years, the countries have been, all countries, no exceptions, have been net contributors to the EU budget because they were not of the capacity to absorb multifold increase in EU funds that fast to be able to compensate for what is a mandatory contribution to the EU budget. And this is the share of your VAT revenues. I'm sorry, I really apologize. That would be immediately withdrawn to the EU budget, and also your co-financing of the EU projects, EU-funded projects. So there is a co-financing at least of 25%, in some cases even 50% of the EU grant-funded projects. So based on even experience of my country, but also countries that joined the EU in 2004, 2007, the first few years, 3 years upon the accession, they have seen a net fiscal impact of EU accession of minus 1.4, minus 1.3% of GDP per year. So de facto, you're losing approximately 1.4 to 1.4% of GDP, because simply the countries were not able to absorb as fast the new available EU grant funding. This, of course, changes over time. And then over time, approximately 70% of overall public investments would be covered by EU grant funding. But this takes time, and it is important to build the absorption capacity for that. And third important element of argument for the fiscal consolidation is that you need to create buffers for aging-related costs. This is important to ensure against the long-term shocks, but you also see that the deficit of your pension system is growing rapidly even now. We also, in the discussion with the government, are discussing what fiscal strategy is needed for recovery and stabilization. And here I want to repeat several of the points I made earlier. One is that current crisis response measures need to be better targeted, and the effectiveness needs to be enhanced and gradually withdrawn, because we are not anymore in the dire crisis situation. Secondly, the public revenue needs to be mobilized not only by widening of the tax base in a non-regressive way, but also scale up all the efforts to fight avoidance and evasion of taxes. Third, composition and efficiency of spending needs to be improved. And here the focus really needs to be to allocating more space for capital spending, and in particular for green investments to avoid such adverse impact of future energy shocks. Primary deficit needs to be permanently reduced in order to stem further public debt growth. And last but not the least, the fiscal rule needs to be enforced, not already called for the escape clauses before the rule is even introduced, and the fiscal council needs to be operationalized. Fiscal rules currently in North Macedonia align with the Maastricht criteria, and also many countries have similar rules. However, there are several issues with how you will interpret these rules. One is that the statistics and the fiscal statistics is not aligned with the ESA 2010 as yet. If such alignment would happen, this would lead to an increase in spending equal to about at least 3% of GDP, because the coverage of the general government would also need to be expanded towards some of the state-owned companies that are performing fiscal functions and are not able to cover these functions with own revenues in excess of 50% of its spending. So this is number one. Number two is that also the country is not yet applying the accrual-based accounts. And if you look at the trends of public sector arrears over time, since 2018, they are observing, since 2019, they're observing growth. I think in June this year, they were approximately 3.2% of GDP. So this increase in the stock of arrears would also need to be added to the current deficit trajectory. And ESA 2010 also requires that you take into account the accrual-based measures of the deficit. Third issue with the fiscal rules is that you need to project the trajectory of and enforcement of the rules before knowing really how your gross domestic product will perform for a particular year. So if you have an optimistic bias in terms of projections, then you may end up in a position where you would argue that the fiscal rules is being achieved with the budget proposed, but de facto ex post, this would not be the case. We have seen this optimistic focus bias omnipresent throughout years, in North Macedonia. So having accurate economic and fiscal forecasting would be extremely important. And last but not the least, the medium-term planning, also, although it is in place, still requires further improvements, because the medium-term plans, as presented in fiscal strategies, are usually not immediately reflected even in that current budget proposal. The last point I want to make is that fiscal rules are extremely important, but their oversight is even more. So what the practice has shown, and many research papers have done on that account, is that yes, having strong fiscal rules fosters fiscal discipline. The more they are entrenched in the constitution or in laws that require a higher majority, the better. The more they are monitored by independent agencies, the better, and they are stronger in terms of enforcement. But also, I think what is clear is that if these fiscal rules enjoy public support and are monitored by the overall public, compliance with these rules becomes very politically important, and therefore it would be more difficult for the authorities to breach fiscal rules. So the public perception of rules is extremely important as well. What's coming up in the new fiscal governance framework in the EU is the fact that the fiscal councils will have fiscal boards, as you wish, would have stronger role in terms of their functions to enforce the rules, to assess the forecast, look at the debt sustainability. And I would argue that North Macedonia has a good perspective to set this institution right. All three members of the council have independence. They have also been selected by independent institutions, have a capacity to understand the fiscal policy, and therefore I'm really looking forward to see the institution starting from a good position immediately. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanja. Ви благодарам, навистина интерес.
Thank you, Sanja. Very interesting attitude in terms of interesting is particular to speak about the fact, although the EU perspective, the time frame of the EU perspective is not known for quite a long time now. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak about how to prepare, and so that we have a bigger benefit of the entire process as a country, in particular, having in mind the fact that the lessons learned from the new member states, if you don't build up capacity before you enter the union, you would have no opportunity to be, as you said in your lecture, using the assistance we have to contribute, on the contrary, to this system, which is illogical when you when you are part of the strong and big union in the first part, but also in the continuation of our discussion, we speak about the fact that we need to have clear fiscal rules, and fiscal rules that provide truly consolidation and good management of finance, public finance. But at the same time, we say we should not create a system where the investments suffer when we don't have economic activity. The economic activity is run and taken by the businesses, by the private sector, and just because of that, today it's an honor to have with us Mr. Zoran Jovanovski. He is the deputy president of the Economic Chamber of Commerce, in the major economist in the chamber, who I'm sure he has a lot to tell you. Zoran, at the beginning, among other, I'd like you to tell us what is the role of the business sector in the wider sense of time when we speak about how good is the management, although the function of the business sector plays a role, core indirect role in these politics, please.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased here to attend this very conference, to take part of this in this debate. Every time a debate is about economic concepts, I'm trying to simplify things and to demystify them, rather to debunk them. Even today, we are talking about the fiscal rules. There are two aspects. They have an expert-based aspect, and there's another aspect which is also important, like the previous one. At the end, we're going to reach what will be said about the role of private sector. Likewise, I'll try to connect things. We're talking about the fiscal policy, fiscal rules, and this is the anti-corruption group, especially anti-corruption fight. I'd like to add something later. For me, fiscal regulations are actually trusting the system, questions of the discipline and protecting the future generations from fiscal disaster. Why they're needed? They're needed to reduce discretionary in the fiscal policy, so that nobody can do whatever he or she likes or whatever he thinks. They should enable to improve the discipline that is sustainable in a long-term context, and that to result in maintaining and reaching a trust in the overall system of the country. This is part of our integration process, but I think also that this is a principal question, regardless of the ongoing integration process of this country. If you don't have financial discipline or fiscal discipline, then you show distrust in the system, both in the Euro integration track. Even without that, you must do something. Here, the path, that is the track, the Euro integration process, and we know what are the fiscal parameters. The path has been paved, has been drawn, projected, but we should miss until the very moment of entering the EU, and then to wait to have these EU rules being applied in this country. One interesting aspect from the past, that's sharing my experience at the macroeconomic level, and then reforms be made. We have had the big results when in some manner we have been forced, so to say, to make that what we have made then, and all that was part of some kind of arrangement with international financial institutions. We have had the International Monetary Fund, we had standby arrangement, very rigid, and then it seems that things were going on in the most easy way, but then from Washington we were ordered, so to say, what to do. Even at level of national mentality, the fiscal rules are part of our story as specific local environment. I have mentioned the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for information which IMF study have said from 2010, 2021. First one, it is widely deficit biased. That is actually the tendency to make huge deficit bias. There's tendency to maintain fiscal policy with huge deficit sometimes. The second knowledge, that there are cases, even in a long-term, mid-term, there is a discretionary fiscal policy. Even without any fiscal regulations, some countries have managed to have good results. The third thing learned is that a fiscal adopting of a country, mentioned by the lady from the World Bank, we need it in our case, Macedonian case, when running the economic policy, it is accompanied by structural reforms, doesn't have to lead to recession. And the third thing learned, the element is critical importance for important fiscal adopting that we need. It is to have prolonging dedication toward the fiscal discipline. Prolonged fiscal discipline. I repeat it again. We have to start to think in a long term, not from today for tomorrow, maybe from 5 to 10 years as of today. So two of these things is mentioned what we are talking about here already. The problem is that so-called deficit bias. We have had a situation where governments, which are democratically elected, are biased to running deficit-based fiscal policy, and after that, deficits are financed by accumulating public indebtedness. That's why I've said the fiscal regulations inter alia also questions of protecting of the future generations. Indeed, the fiscal rules are used to correct the deficit bias, so-called, and to protect the future of the country and future generation, which means that the formula is pretty explicit. We need long-term fiscal policy adopting, accompanied by transparency that will result in a fiscal discipline. We need just to have long-term dedication, commitment. The fiscal regulations are good for the country. What has been also mentioned by the lady from the World Bank, if the limitation of the speed of the path is 60 kilometers per hour, and I'm driving a car 80 kilometers per hour, nobody's punishing me, then I'm not talking about personally, I'm talking about figurative manner, from aspect of the perception that the rules are not nominal, just to be on paper, but they have sense if they're accompanied by certain sanctions and punishment for their non-application. That is exceptionally important in the case of our country, because I'll again recall what the lady of the World Bank has said, is it too tendency to have over-optimistic projections about the economic growth, and after that we have to have budget rescheduling. And of the predictability of the environment for the businesses to run, it is very clear as a day. The fiscal regulations help in that direction. The businessmen investing would like to know what are the projections for next year, for the year after that, what are the planning of huge investment in some uncertainty. It carries a lot of risk and challenges, and the least that the government can do is through such fiscal regulations to help at least to eliminate just part of that certain uncertainty or mitigate it. At the beginning, I've said there are two aspects. One is the expert aspect of this question, and the second aspect is how much we are actually essentially prepared to change the things and to introduce the fiscal regulations even tomorrow. How much are we prepared indeed to make them all the necessary adoptions to go within the framework of the fiscal regulations, and not to justify, explain ourselves why, because of one or other or next reason why haven't implemented them. Which means, in other words, everything starts and everything ends with the political will to drive things as they should be done. As illustration for the political will, I'd like to add here what Professor Tevlohi has mentioned, the question of the gray economy sector, informal economy. We like to talk about fiscal regulations and their respect, and have this monster in the room that is here present for 30 years in the independence of the country, and we have the feeling that something is really going on to eliminate that. From the Economic Chamber of the Republic of North Macedonia, you know, the Professor Alexander Stoikov, university professor, and me together, we have made an analysis. The gray economy the great part of Macedonian economy, its greatness, its implications and solutions. That was our contribution to local economic magazine. Everybody, after this event, if you have the wish, I'll give you the link of my contribution. What has this analysis shown? That the Professor Stoikov has made the evaluation 2022 at 33% of the GDP is actually the amount of the grey economy in Macedonia. If that percent is 1/3 actually, is applied to the figures and the projection of that year. Let me just also say, at level of the EU, 27 countries is 19.4% of the economy. We are almost 33%. The lost revenues, about more than 1 billion euros. If we actually get to nobody can root out this grey economy. Then we're going to have 450 million, much more bigger revenues in the budget. After that, and having 450 million euros in the budget, you don't need to introduce so-called solidarity taxation, another that violate and disturb the certainty of the economic environment. You're going to have a much more stable economy for conducting the fiscal policy. Green economy sector is actually the twin brother of cash and the cash flows, which is mentioned by Professor Tedowski, and both of them drive the corruption. And this is a vicious circle closed, so to say, going around the vicious circles. We can be part of that about the fiscal regulations in expert concept, and essential nothing will get changed there. Well, having an expert debate, if other part is just left to operate as it is 30 years in the independence of the country. Profession is profession, but also other part requires something to do with that. In that context, in the fighting anti-corruption, let me tell you, there is a huge project, Citizens Against Corruption. We have had a 5-year project, a very serious one. Representatives of the NGO sector, research journalism, economic chamber as representative of the NGO sector, we must find the modus operandi, how to change things if we want to go forward. And nobody can tell us just abruptly from the sky. Here we reach to the very question, what can the private sector do? An economic chamber through the project for fighting corruption will give its own contribution, is going to promote that with the overall private sector. Court of honor. Coming out of this aspect, we have a call. We don't have any rule use of the fiscal rules if we don't implement them. We should show will to change things. All people of goodwill are on the same side. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think that we're going to continue in the right direction, and I have the feeling that we're going to have such an expert discussion about the fiscal regulations. We're going to have a unison agreement how to conduct these policies. And if such discussion have been transposed into practice, into implementing what you're talking about, what Zoran has said, I think then we're going to have proper effects on the entire economic system. Today, together is one, according to me, one of the most respected former ministers of finance, in whose tenure of office, actually since the very establishment of the independence of the country, former Minister of Finance, Mr. Khaireddini, would like to share a lot thus about this very topic. What are the lessons learned from the past that we can apply now to be much more prepared what follows in the future? Mr. Khaireddini, please take the floor. I received the invitation of this esteemed institution and organization. Actually, just I wouldn't like to be so much experienced, just to be like Victor. Okay. I have asked Mileva, Madam Mileva, the chairwoman, this, how do you call it? Yes, convention about the European Union, the very fact that he has connection and relates with the EU. On many other occasions, we made contact with NGO and on television shows. I've asked that the agenda, part of the agenda item talking about fiscal policy and regulations in the country, in the EU. I wouldn't like to waste any time. We have heard the theoretical aspect, the very competent professors here in Macedonia. Monetary, fiscal, financial, economic policy, they can talk a lot well. The second thing is, we know that what are the expectations and what are the requirements. The President of the European Commission, Madam der Leyen, she also said, explained what is topical and what Macedonia should deliver. Taking into consideration the present circumstances, I have asked on this debate there were some government and assembly high officials were invited. I can see them here at the table. However, in these times when we talk about what should be the fiscal policy and the fiscal regulations, how to be Macedonia now, we know how they should be. The second thing is the colleagues present all the time discussing rhetorically, we. Let me make some distinction. It is not about we. We don't represent everyone. It seems that we haven't seen the Minister of Finance, his deputy, his assistant minister. We are lacking the presence of officers and officials from Ministry of Finance. So their absence tells you a lot, whether they would like to hear us or not. Indeed, we have discussed everything, what is important, how the policies should be run and the policies, but we are witnessing here, everyone here, that this very government, even the most competent economic and finance ministries, that they every day, it's since 2 or 3 years since they have taken office, in their government propaganda every day, they boast that they have such a program, that they have such fiscal regulations that they are applying as the Minister of Finance and the Deputy Prime Minister for Economic Policy. One, the Minister of Finance, every week writes columns about financial policies and economic policies. And according to him, the President Minister of Finance mentioned in his weekly columns all the Nobel Prize winners for economy. He knows them by name. but it seems that he has too much. He has an accelerated program for development of Macedonia and smart finances, in which he plans that from 2022-23 until 2027, 5 or 4 years, Macedonia would have an annual growth rate of 5.4%. The Deputy Minister of Economy has a long-term strategy, 2022, 2040 to 20 years of long-term development. I think, therefore, we need to see realistically where we stand when we were talking about what should be done, what EU requires from us. What are the high government officials doing that are absent here? Here, I'd like to remind the people that are attending this conference. So all the high government officials, the prime minister, deputy prime ministers, we can read their columns every day. We hear them on the TV news. It's not that they're ignorant of economic policies. They're highly learned, highly skilled. Now we actually have the dilemma where the problem lies. Where do these recommendations go? It seems there's the other huge problem facing Macedonia now. In political context, can our elected politicians implement these recommendations? Can our elected politicians, the present government especially, can they follow and respect the fiscal rules and regulations? They do not explain, they do not tell us that the World Bank will be 1.6 or 1.5 annual growth rate. They don't tell us. I'm sorry. I wouldn't like to offend anyone. They tell us, they brag, they boast that Macedonia, we are a state at this very moment, is the best one economically standing in the region. So if you have such a government official bragging, boasting that we are best economically in the region, you expect from him to obey and respect these recommendations. Or the day before, yesterday, which even worse, he has connected with the EU and it has association with this convention. 2 days ago, the President of the European Commission was here. She told us directly in the face, you have made an unbelievable, let me read in the paper, incredible reforms you have made. When she knows that the EU ambassador delegated to Skopje, Richard Gere, that Macedonia, that the Macedonian Assembly abuses the European flag when proposing and voting urgent laws, actually pardoning prisoners and punished people to let them get free out of jail. Recently adopted in Macedonian Assembly laws. So we have to weigh out this. There is my colleague, Mr. Bishev. He is one of the top experts in monetary policies. He was former governor of the National Bank of Macedonia. He has been named as a member of that fiscal council. So this assembly, this government, upon the proposal of this government, this assembly elects you. You have what is going to be your work there? I think that you are going just to defend of the government that nominated you and or the assembly that elected you, the people, the high government officials that appoint you to be a member and president of that fiscal council, of course, you're going to defend the government policies. So even the government officials boast that they've been using the help of German experts to have this long-term 20-year strategy of development of the country. But we know, we can read between lines, the present government, according to the Minister of Finance, it gives the most energetic reply in the Western Balkans region to the energy and prices crisis. He lives in such his belief. We know that the COVID crisis consequences, that the government ministers of agriculture, finance ministers, and finance ministers to go around through the neighboring countries to seek urgent financial and agriculture and food help and vaccine. We know that at that time to seek urgent wheat and corn import from Serbia, to seek energy help from Bulgaria. No minister from the neighboring countries has come to Macedonia to seek help. And I'm asking the present government officials, you're saying that we are the leader of the Balkans? Now we have the World Bank data and reports that the economic growth rate in Albania is now 3.6, double the Macedonian economic rate. Kosovo is 3.2, Montenegro 4.2, Bosnia and Serbia more than 2. Macedonia is just about 1.8. And I'm following the news. So where are we now? In the skies? In a limbo where? At the end, it's my personal opinion, things are here as they are. The main preoccupation of the present government is, and also the assembly opposition is also partly to blame, not because there are forthcoming parliamentary and presidential elections of the country. Now we know that the pre-election campaigns are coming out. So both the government and the opposition parties are trying, especially to urgently adopt the constitutional amendments. I am for that, so that we should immediately open our negotiation process with the EU, but actually to try to convince us, the common citizens of the country, that Macedonia in the first years after it would join the EU, then there will be 100% of pay raise. So it is realistic. When Macedonia, God help us, join sometimes in the far future, and after 5 years, after then having become member of the EU, there is the government officials boasting that, look, people, your salaries, your pays would be 100% raised. Based on what is this kind of prediction in a crystal ball? Where did you find this analysis? Where did you find this prediction? On what did you base it? Now is the very moment. Von der Leyen has said, both in Tirana and here, don't think 2030 is the year of your joining the EU. It is your Deputy Vice Minister for Integration, Maricic, telling you for domestic purposes. 2030 should be just some kind of possible joining year of possible joining the EU. Don't take it too strictly. We are facing a lot of problems about inflation, the growth of prices. There are certain situations, circumstances that Macedonia and even the government cannot solve them. Why we cannot influence them? Neither the government does it want. We are actually too much open to foreign trade. 40% of the products are from outside. High participation of the food and energy in the inflation rate is 50%. Euros only 30%. High energy intensity of the domestic economy, 3 times more the average one. So you need years to change the structure of that, the energy structure, the reliance on foreign import of energy. So actually, we're spending much more energy, wasting energy than 3 times more than the EU. That is the World Bank data. Green energy is very important. We don't have any green energy. The photovoltaic that we're mounting on the roofs just give actually that the date above installment of the mounted power. So what's the actually the most part of the electricity comes from the dams made in the former Yugoslavia, but 84% of the electricity produced in Macedonia is made from coal power plants, low quality coal. 84% of domestic electricity is made by coal fuel power plants, electricity making plants. Just one. So somebody mentioned that Macedonia in the future will become maybe the second or third electricity producing country. I don't believe that. We should be duly informed by the government. So when hearing such incredible things from government officials, one should ask them, do you live in Macedonia? For the last 3 years, the finance minister, they actually are saying that they're trying very hard to have some foreign investment. There is enough investment and venture capital in the world. Last year, he went to the International Monetary Fund, the finance minister. He said that we have at our disposal for 900 million euros for the liquidity of the state. Of course, we have such drawing rights, and we don't need to spend all these 900 million euros in 1 or 2 years. For the fiscal aspect of the economic policy, if there's Macedonia, some kind of factor that we can trust in, both in the will and the experts, it is there is running the monetary policy that is by the Central Bank of Macedonia. Everything else, the government, the assembly, They're facing huge problem. Many of them actually are corrupted. They should have been already in jail. Now we have actually had to vote in the National Assembly, the amendments to the Constitution, but it seems that the present government is also proposing an amnesty law to pardon former and even present highest government officials. This is it. Thank you very much for you. There's one thing that I should draw from your speech. It was mentioned in the previous discussions that the political will in this process is very important, most important, to construct a system that will be open to change the political will, that everyone together to agree there's the long-term policies that we'd like to implement in the country. They should be consensually adopted and not introduced by government, or they have some other institutions, they have a momentous interest. Here we close this part of the session, panel discussion, and for the sake of time that we'd like to give.
For those who are here, I'd like to open the discussion for all of you. And you have any comments, questions, or something that you believe could be open as a topic, for which should be part of the recommendations that will come out from today's session, to call up and to get into the discussion. Just a more minute. You mentioned, Zoran Jovanovski mentioned that previously there was a time when I was minister that standby arrangements, I have to say, I am witnessing that time, and I was signatory of first contracts with the WB and together with the governor with the IMF. Not that Zoran mentioned that we could excuse ourselves, that the politics then was a burden to us when we come in front of the assembly. Yes, clear, we have the arrangement of the IMF, and they have forbidden some of the expenditures that have been inherited by the communism to remove them. But it is not true that they have imposed something. When we spoke about, if we convince him that this year cannot go, because the people say K15. What is K15? That is the money that people receive for the holiday money, you see. So this is what we talk about, or the reform of the payment, the SOK. That was not too bad to have the payment not in the banks, although in the communism the director was done what the committee, what the party has applied, but that was then like this, but then it ceased to be like that, and now we had not in the public, we did not have a resistance. There were not such options. We said the communism is dead, now everything will be fine and normal. We would have market economy, the prices will be determined by the market, and then the prime minister goes with the and says which prices have been increased, but how far would that be like this, you know, that the Minister of Economy enters every evening to tell us how much the potato will cost, etc. It doesn't say the price grows. It's either not growth or it falls, they say. But the people come to the market and see that, etc. That's it. Thank you. I share the same opinion with you that the international partners, the financial institutions are ready to finance what is truly supported and what has logic. And if it has positive effects over the economy, they are ready to finance that. On the other hand, if we strive to be members of the EU, I'm convinced that we must finally phrases to start building up in praxis the administration and the system, so that we see more resilient, become more resilient on such crises and changes, not to depend only on political will, but to have a functional system independent of the politicians. The politicians might give certain directions, ideologies, but the way should be prepared supported by the functional system, independently from the political will and situation. Now, it is your time, to all people who attend here, who had the opportunity to express their opinion, but also those who were not involved in the discussion so far. If you have any questions, comments, theses that we have to in mind, to share them with all attendants here. So the floor is open, as we say in English. It's always difficult to be the first. The anti-corruption, and how far is that?
Можно.
Указувана корупција,
The speaker about corruption, and the deputy, the first deputy says anti-corruption, yes, they have no capacities to do their job. And what else can you say further? They have no capacity. They have no will, no capacity. Nobody asks them, you know. Nobody asks the revision, the auditing, please. I would like to use my journalist reflection and to ask a question. I have ex-ministers, governors here with me, also former minister. I'd like to ask you if hypothetically a brave government comes in office, and very clever economically government, with which 2 or 3 moves, some say to lay off half of the administration, to change the regulations, to fight against crime, etc. Which are the 3 measures that government must undertake in a relatively quick period of time in the economy, 5 to 10 years perhaps, to come to this 10% of growth a year, or to come to European salaries, to increase the unemployment to a reasonable level, up to 5% we normal? Which are these moves that a brave government must undertake, so that we journalists pressure politicians to do that? I want to hear from you, because you have economic knowledge, you're very well educated in the economy, you have experience in the work. What would you give 2 or 3 moves to the government, and they would boost immediately, and Macedonia will become an economic tiger? I'll give room to those who want to answer this question, but I also take the liberty to answer to the part of the question, as long as the remainder of thinking. You said the thesis, which is very often heard in the public, and that is we have one of the ways the policies is shortening of the public administration. That is a myth that is placed in the public, and we see the figures. We see that the Macedonian administration, compared to the participation administration in the workforce and employers in the economy, is lower than any other country member of the EU. Which means that the myth that we have a very big administration is not correct. What we need to do, and on which we have to work on, are 2 things. The first is the efficacy or the efficiency, but economically it's logical to have relatively tight administration, but we expect efficiency, but we can work with less administration. Maybe the most important thing here is the services that the public administration gives, the quality of the services and the scope of the services that public administration offers. That is not a topic of discussion, but the coverage of the primary school in Macedonia is 40%. The percentage is 96 in this year in the kindergarten level. The coverage. We speak about public services that this public sector should cover. Let's not speak about to open all the other additional topics. If the cash in the industry is one of the tools that should help us to crack down the gray economy, the efficiency of the public administration is one of the tools into the digitalization. Believe me, I've been in the administration, I've worked there. I respect the colleagues very much in the public administration, particularly those who the public doesn't see. We don't speak about the servants, those who go to work, those who carry the system. Yeah, they get the money, they get the salary, but it's they have a huge respect for all those who truly work. But what majority of them do? They do manual processes that can, with digitalization, be replaced. And I'll give you a Plastica an example. We work with the Ministry of Education. There are top professionals there in these sectors. When I go to meetings during the day, they cannot stop answering the phone. You know what's the only thing for which we talk about? Cases and who asked employment in which school. And on the contrary, when we speak about these people who work in the public administration, we see that they have a potential to build serious system policies. Instead of spending time in serious policies, we burden them with processes that are for a former system, a system that is truly not committed to result, but only to employing of certain cases. You want to? I understood. Yeah, that is hypothetically when it comes to that. And when I tell you to come to what is necessary to be changed, you would understand this is illusion for now, that such government will come. Government is the assembly must elect the government, yes. Secondly, for illustration, when would that come? When now we have ministers and directors on power who publicly say that my boss is the leader of the party with name and surname because he has assigned me here as a minister or a director. Whereas, wait a minute, the prime minister, so the prime minister respected as every citizen in the country. So when can we expect that this would be changed and that the government will not be elected like this? For now, I don't see that this will happen. And what will be to come to 10% of economic growth? This is illusion. And secondly, I see that all the time they praise themselves that they bring money from hundreds of millions from abroad in investments. I'd like to use this because I want in practice before I was minister in the big systems, those loans from the Chinese bank for the construction of the 2 highways. One of them for 10 years, it's not finished yet. And these corridors, the so-called 8 corridor, they will be such deep budget costs that no one, I asked people, just tell me how much are we now have to pay per month on these Chinese banks as interest rates? 1.3 billion for the corridors. That is coming from the pocket. You see, now there are geotechnical research, Bechtel and Enka produce it, to become the base to prepare the projects here, the main project. There is no main project here. Ask engineers based on what you came to this 1.3 billion euros cost. Even the project is not yet, and they pay hundreds of millions for things that you don't see only on television. They speak about geostrategic investigation, where the alignment will go. It is ignorance now, but you know for what political purposes was this used, the propaganda. The American ambassador said we have to investigate the contract because if there's corruption with Bechtel and Lienka, that measures should be undertaken. Next time everything is fine, they say next time. And the prime minister says, be careful. Someone remembers, someone's not. We don't hide the contract, but you can see it. Is there a logic there? We don't hide it, but you can't see it. But you see it now. You have insight in it. Tell me. That's corruption. But this topic here is that's corruption. Thank you. Please, yes. Truly very professional and interesting discussion. I would say professional. We who strictly do not deal with questions in terms of finance, why do we have this in our everyday life? I have a few questions. I was initiated by Mr. Khaireddini for these questions that I have noted during the presentation of our speakers. One of the questions is related to Mr. Bishev, and in terms of the presentation, that was truly clear, exhausting, is a very ideal form how they should be set up. And now, in the framework of the National Convention, we are trying, that's why the title of the session is such, Fiscal Rules of the EU, which can initiate us to think more on our national context. We have the rules, yes, but how applicable are they in our country? And Mrs. Sanja Schuster has truly showed us on certain conditions and norms that should be introduced before implementation as rules, before we strictly stick to them. What is the essence and how should this be done? What are the segments that the gentleman asked? What are the first steps that we need to make? Truly, we have a lot to do, and I am thankful to those who asked this question. The fiscal rules, let's think a bit further in what we have to initiate us to go faster in that regard. The question is, Mr. Bishev mentioned that the equation mentioned for the linkage with the indebtedness and the investments, that is an equation where we compare the indebtedness and the investments. Now, since I wanted more to link that with our concrete situation, whether you think that how do we stand here in this regard, in this equation that you mentioned with investments and their expectations I don't speak only about those who we have more attention, but on wider investment plans, how do we stand in our country? Also, perhaps Mr. Kuzer will answer to the question of the colleagues. You have a picture on the problems that we are facing now in terms of the questions on the fiscal rules and discipline. The that you have in Slovenia. Maybe you can give us more about the first steps that it is useful to do here. You mentioned in your presentation several steps and important questions that you have several times highlighted. This is a question that we need to discuss upon. But I'd like to just to tell us in the answering of these questions that you mentioned, and they are related to what the colleague journalist asked. Maybe in some of the sessions we can pick about informal economy, and I trust that this is important question for us. We have strategies, we have regulations in terms of the informal economy. However, in the realistic, we have very different situations. These figures of 33% informal economy are the lowest limitation of determination of the official percentage, but we speak about the numbers that even go much higher, up to 45% informal economy or gray economy. So these are the dilemmas that come out from the presentations. I hope to have a discussion on these concrete issues, particularly in terms of the investments. And one more question, maybe to Mr. Terdowski, to Professor Terdowski, because in a way we wanted to link these fiscal rules with the struggle against corruption, and to explain this linking mechanism, those who have not involved in this mechanism that you understand and that you have, I would like truly to have a bit more to understand them. Thank you. Before I give the floor to the guest, mention the discussion on the gray economy is part of the second cluster. Thus, I trust we have mentioned this many times. We lack economic essential discussion in the framework of the processes. So that again, an opportunity to say that this format of work should be widened also to other economic cluster in the EU integration process. Yeah, that's a question to the donors. Yeah. I go to how the speakers have been called up. So, Mr. Bishop, should you have any comment or an answer to that, please? There is no, what they say, panacea, one medicine, and do you solve, and you give aspirin and all the sicknesses are removed. If there was such thing, we would have all taken it. We only see the experience of the successful countries, and we say, let's recognize from these positive experiences what is in common and what can be used in us. We must find our own way, our own flight. And in these discussions, I'd say it was positive mentioned the National Bank. However, at the National Bank, there is one indicator, the exchange rate. You wake up in the morning, in every country sees whether the exchange rate is stable or unstable. And the National Bank is forced, because we all see that, to keep it stable. And you cannot say it's a little stable, it's a little unstable. You see it from minute to minute. And such strategy is exactly for those countries that have weak institutions. Otherwise, not a country has targeted the fixed exchange rate course. So what can be that, which is a fixed exchange rate for the National Bank, as a rule, as an indicator for the fiscal policy? When we have weak institutions, the whole public looks at that and put pressure, and it will say that's it. So what all talk we spoke, there has to be a simplified rule, should be easily understood. Yes, and we all say the fiscal part or strategy or whatever However, what is that? What you, on a short term, maybe it could not be on a daily basis, but what is it? What can at least on a monthly basis the public will see, and that's why they all for transparent finances. The more data. One of the ideas now is for every expenditure in the budget to have benefits that it brings. And how do you see the expenditure? At the same time, you can see what benefits it brings. So there are many ways of thinking, and the ideas from the public, whether it is professional or other, those who have experience in the EU or abroad, we do not put in question the long-term strategies and rules. The question is, under the conditions of weak institutions, how to mobilize the public. What the lady from the World Bank said, clear, foreseeable, and easy controllable fiscal rules that introduce discipline and would not undermine the growth in investments and all that to give long-term results. Thank you very much. I'm glad that again in the discussion we have transparency and accountability, and what Alexander Ender mentioned, that Zoran mentioned as well, and that is the financial literacy of the public, to have a public that will hold responsible the political elites and all those who carry the politics. We must work on the public to understand the wider audience, wider. Not everyone should know everything about the public finance. That's why this is very good expressed. We need to find a simple mechanism, an indicator that should be understandable for all, and that all can, in a certain measure, have a look at it on a regular basis. That is much more difficult in the fiscal policy because we do not have only one indicator, but we can always work on its optimization. You have comments on the answer, please.
For everything, it's not, especially I don't want to recommend you or your country for some policy, because we really have to look, you know, each country have this different backgrounds, and also the size of public sector is different, the industries and so on. So it's really difficult that if somebody that does not know so in deep what is going on here to give you some answers like that. But from my experience in Slovenia, I have started to work actually when we start the accession negotiations. I was trainee at that time, but I know I read last days, I read some articles from our one of previous finance ministers, and he said, for example, that before we entering the 2004 the EU, and then after then the EMU, I mean the euro area, at that moment was inflation also a bit a problem, I think, and this .com crisis and so on. And the minister wrote in the article that they make on the top very not favorable decision, and they frozen all transfers at the moment so that we could keep down the inflation and make easy enter to the EU. I'm just saying that sometimes it is policies are not friendly, let's say. No, it is. I remember then in 2013 when we have really big crisis in the debt crisis because of the banking sector, and also that Ministry of Finance make a linear cut of expenditures that we could go to on the markets and get loans. But when I saw the picture, we could learn from this that And I have worked at that time also in the Ministry of Development, and we have been theoretically, we advocate we should cut expenditures that are not so growth friendly. No, this was theoretical approach. But when you came to the reality, this is sometimes not possible if you have to act quick. But what we have to avoid is that we have to find balance between investments that stimulate growth and cut of the or make efficient other expenditures. Now, this is the discussion that we need to have now. And of course, the structural reforms that are behind, maybe sometimes they have more impact on growth and the GDP growth than expenditures per se. Here it's also there are a lot of theoretical analyses, estimations, evaluations, and whatever. And I read 1 week ago some paper on the competitiveness of the euro area, and then it was written, in one paragraph, the recommendations that we know already, I don't know, 20 years, so better functioning of good markets and so on, labor markets. So we know the measures, but we need just to implement them somehow. This I would bring to discussion.
Thank you. Poglавје, Dragan.
Thank you. Generally, I'd like to say that I'd like the discussion. I think more between economists, it's much more easier if there are no different attitudes that can understand each other. I also like the question on which are the 3 measures. This is something that should challenge us how to proceed. Generally, I agree with what Gligor said, that I said that many times on public events in Macedonia, that I am not so calling that. Do not believe to someone who will tell you that overnight you can change things. Now, to give you my point of view, there is no 3 measures that can change everything. But generally, the experience that I have in the last years, both in the Ministry of Finance, in the IMF as well, I reckon that one of the major things that we need to see here is political economy behind, which are the interest groups that stay behind the things. And I believe this is the key, generally through a simple example. For the gray economy, yes, true. Generally, it's very correct analysis about the 32% of the economy, but generally speaking, do not think that the plumber or haircut or a barber or those who are against the solving of the gray economy, but these are mostly the biggest players who exist in the economy, who practically are the obstacle. I know how I fought to lower the payment threshold for cash payment in the economy. The second thing that I think is important, I agree with Zoran Jovanovski about the long term. Yeah, that is very important in the economy. We must see the long term in the economy. And Victor started speaking about that. If I have to choose one thing that must be after this a measure, that would be the education. Why? I spoke about that. Sanya also spoke about that. Generally, the economically long term, according to the year, it is based on the function that would also function on the labor capital and how these factors are combined and the productivity. So we as a country, because of the migration, we are losing labor force, and the only thing that we can truly do to have a potential product that will grow on a long term is to attract capital, and our people who are here, who work here, to have as much as possible education, because that will determine their productivity. I reckon that one good thing, if we have to choose, if you see the PISA tests, if you see the indicators of the World Bank with the development of the human capital, we are not good at all here. So the education is the area that we have to make much better. To practically, we spoke a lot about investment, but the education, how it will determine the future growth of the economy, because this determines also is key, is crucial. And secondly, we should not forget the European Convention for the EU. We must not forget that also EU is very important in this process. There was a conference of the Academy of Science a few months ago with a colleague. I wrote a work where we say that if the country does not enter the EU, if the EU accession is postponed, then this will have not convergence of the expenditure of the income. It will it will divert our income with member countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia. Why? Because they have used the structure of funds already of the EU, which are billions in grants, finance by investments, with investments, finance, education, finance, the green transition. And practically, if we more than a decade moves and we cannot use them, there's no dilemma, there's no the special statistic knowledge that this will make a divergence. That's why this process is important to know. Also, I liked the question that was opened by Sanya about the independent institutions. I fully agree with the fact that the National Bank is an institution which should be seen. This is Mr. Karedini, distinguished as a role model. And now this process of the Euro integration, basically, we should make only by institutions with the capacity. So the focus must be on how these institutions will have the best people, or if not the best, but at least the good people, the quality people, because this is our country. These are those who should fight for the interests of this country. It cannot be different. This European Convention called the Governor of Croatian National Bank, Boris Vučić, who is a very distinguished and respected in Europe and in the world, a person who was called, you know what we called him? He's a governor. He was a negotiator of Croatia, deputy negotiator in the negotiations in Europe. They had called up the best people in this process, and they have even surpassed Bulgaria and Romania. We entered the Eurozone. They're making extreme progress. I was always fighting for the fact that institutions are a picture of us, and generally, you know, and the intention must always be, how do we bring the best people there? And I'll give you the answer on the question, what is the link with the fiscal rules, with the corruption? I think that was obvious, but generally the fiscal rules set limits on a long term. They should send the limits on the spending, and they disable, they enable discretional right before elections, between elections, to think more on political results without taking into consideration the fiscal sustainability of the country. So the existence of these rules will disable such malversations. I think Zoran explained it well, that then this is also linked with all, if you have such opportunities, You have ways how to finance corruption afterwards, etc. And from what I heard today, we shouldn't have dilemma that the country must go towards a fiscal path and to think of introduction of rules.
Indeed, fruitful comments, discussion, questions. I don't know whether you would like to add. It is very easy to cite the National Bank of Macedonia, but the dilemma is where to find a partner, a pandan in the fiscal policy. You're going to be member of the fiscal council. Government officials say that they have saved 200 million euros, that they would actually give it to subsidies to the poorer layers of population. Just have the Minister of Finance let go out in the public and say that budget item was so expensive, now it is less. Now he should come out with evidence-based data for all budget items. Or Minister Terdowski. Thousands of people have taken their salary from the national budget, but nobody has asked the Slovenian advisor from which budget item we can save. So actually we're pumping to the pension fund, the insurance fund, invalid persons fund from the national budgets. So somebody has mentioned transparency, digitalization, yes. So these budgetary users just show explicitly which budgetary national budget users have taken less and show them. And how did you do that? You're working, of course, you have high salaries for government officials. You should work for the sake of the people. Otherwise, just go out of the government, leave your office. Anything others would like to reply, or we're going to finish? Thank you very much. With great attention, I have followed this discussion of the National Convention. Although this topic is far away from my interest and my expertise, there are interesting aspects. My consideration of this fruitful debate go about the control mechanisms, especially oversight mechanism, which was 2 times mentioned, and through discussions will be go further. When you have such a complex situation, that it is very difficult to find quick solutions for. People criticize the gray zones of national economy and the human resources policy. I do not understand if the financial minister is actually considered as the guardian of the national budget. What is the point? And then the oversight mechanisms are important. It seems that public prosecution doesn't react at all, or they react very slowly. The positive example is the National Bank, as mentioned. So I'm not an expert about the National Bank being control mechanism, I think it is an institution that has integrity even in these circumstances that exist in the country, and also the State Audit Office. It has integrity. So the key question is the integrity that we lack, both at institutional level and personal level. So to reach some certain desired level, we should have visions, we should have diaries. So the oversight mechanisms that are unique tool that can be used to iron out the bumps or the gray zones or the criminal that we have in the community can be enforced, can get greater powers, greater strength. Maybe you can mention good practice, good examples that can be integrated in our daily practice. Thank you very much about this context. In the context of zero integration, the State Audit Office and parts are the only parts of the integration process that in the annual reports by the European Commission have received highest grades. That is, they are almost fully harmonized with the European acquis communautaire, which means that in the auditing in the public institutions, we have a very good base. So we don't need actually to be whipped or driven by somebody outside to do our own homework. So these good examples should be followed and processed throughout the entire state system. So you cannot have total integrity of the system just having with one institution being good example, the State Audit Office, spending public money in function of election goals, election targets. I think the previous session of this working group, financial of political parties, was mentioned. It's one of the mechanisms that we should prevent, that the system should be independent and free of political partisanship and influence, but it seems that it's very difficult to do it and to see very tangible results. So I would like to tire out. Then I give the finishing remarks to Madam Chairwoman. Victor, I've understood this as a call that we should finish. Time is ripe. What we should maybe stick more to the agenda. However, as a coordinator from the organizational context, I should say the finishing remarks. And of course, is left as further follow-up of the session. Actually, this dialogue is not yet finished by the finish of the session. We have had draft recommendations put on the table. Their entry level recommendations, we give them in the beginning. And given the course of a specific discussion, very often it comes out that we have new recommended proposed recommendations, or maybe some recommendation being changed. We can also send them through your email. If you have comments, I kindly ask you to write them, or maybe you would like to suggest new recommendations rising out of the discussion in the topic. Please give us in electronic version in Word format your comments or your guidelines, maybe for the draft recommendations. You can also suggest new ones. These recommendations, after that being processed, they become public. We send them to relevant state institutions. We publish them in the media outlets. and thus become adopted recommendations from our experience thus far. We know that state institutions generally take seriously into considerations our recommendations, and a good part of them are being implemented in the public policies. They are not just of formal character, just to remain some kind of formal conclusion of a work done within the convention. So we make them in our meetings with office holders. The topic is very wide, maybe just too extensive for one session for 3.5 hours. This is the first approach to this topic. We're going to continue that topic consideration even the next year. We have had really relevant experts present here that have given us a good overview of the main directions, so to say, of roadmaps as said by our ministers. This is the key term, roadmap. We still are missing the roadmaps in this context. We're going to continue to try to find them and to have a follow-up of this great discussion. We expect you. Also, we're going to invite you in the plenary conference that will also consider topics of this strictly of cluster 1, chapter 24, and of course the other chapters that touch this topic of the working group anti-corruption. That will be in December. We're going to use all the experts and all working groups so that you'll be duly informed time. Mr. Haridini has also mentioned this is a structured dialogue. It has been going on for 6.5 years. It shows you what kind of dialogue is that, how it functions. Let me tell you, or I'll explain. We have had very close cooperation with the relevant institutions, and some with one we didn't have expect that, especially the Minister of the Interior, and also with the National Assembly. When we have organized our sessions in the National Assembly, we have had 25 conference sessions in the hall Boris Trajkovsky in the Assembly. We have had then the attendance of many MPs. I'm really satisfied when I see MPs and government officials actively discussing. So we have very good sound basis to continue further. We'll continue to work until the very moment when the institutions will see when they have a very good benefit of this dialogue. We're not criticizing, we're just giving comments and advice. Now, all of these that are present here to continue our dialogue. I think that was floor number 6. If you're taking the elevator, it will be much more faster, but maybe you can use also the stairs. We have a very good panoramic view of Skopje. We have rather modest lunch, not the dinner, but modest lunch. It is modest because it is paid by the NGO sector. Thank you very much for your dedication and presence. And also we can make one family photo. Family photo.